I sure did enjoy all of that singing tonight. Thank you so much. And Brother Bartlett, always you do a great job with the choir as well. And thank you so much for being here. I'm directing your attention to the book of Matthew, chapter number 12. Matthew, chapter number 12. We're so glad to have all of our visitors all over the house of God tonight. Thank you so much for coming. We appreciate the lady that got saved during the service yesterday. I was standing on the altar during the invitation time, and I seen her come running down and grab the staff by the hand and said, "I'm lost, I need to be saved." And that's the sweetest words you'll ever hear this side of the grave. And then Dr. Buchanan told me another man was saved after service last night. We thank God for that. And thank you again for coming. Don't forget the service tomorrow night at the 7 o'clock hour as well. Matthew chapter number 12, verse number 43. When the unclean spirit is gone out of a man, he walketh through dry places seeking rest, and findeth none. Then he saith, I will return into my house from whence I came out. And when he is come, he findeth it empty, swept, and garnished. Then goeth he and taketh with himself 7 other spirits, more wicked than himself, and they enter in and dwell there. And the last state of the man is worse than the first. Even so shall it be also unto this wicked generation. Now, I don't want to go in great detail about demonology tonight. That's not the factor of my message, but the Word of God is talking about this foul spirit that dwelt in the tabernacle of a human being and for whatever reason departed for a period of time. When this foul spirit returned to this dwelling, he found that the individual was swept and empty and garnished, but it was empty. And because it was empty, he entered in again. And he not only entered in himself, but the Bible said he took 7 other spirits more wicked than himself, which proves to me there are different levels of depravity even in the spirit world. But the saddest thing you will read in that verse is the closing commentary, that the last part of his life was worse than the first. I don't know of anything worse that could be said about an individual than to say their departing days were the worst days of their life. I feel like God wants me to preach tonight a serious message on the subject, the last chapter of your life. If tonight were the last chapter of your life or my life, I wonder what would be pinned down as a testimony to the conclusion of our life upon earth. Because those of us that believe the Bible, we know life is but a vapor that appeareth for a while and then vanisheth away. We know that today could be the last chapter of our life. So if this was yours, what is going to be said and written about you when you are gone? When I started working in a funeral home back in the 70s, the elderly man that taught me to embalm, he was 78 years old, and I'll never forget what he said to me. We went and picked up a young lady that had expired in a car accident, and we brought her back to the embalming room, and we were taking her shoes off. And that silver-haired man looked at me and said this. He said, she had no idea when she put her shoes on this morning that she would never live long enough to take them off tonight. So you may not live long enough to even get your shoes off tonight. So because we're aware of the fact that every day could be the last chapter of our life, we ought to be ultra sensitive to make sure that we live today like we want to be remembered when we're gone. And so I want to take you on a journey, if I could please tonight. I want to take you to 4 different funerals in the Bible. And every one of us are going to fit within one of these 4 funerals as the last chapter of our life when we leave. I like what B.R. Lincoln said one time. Dr. B.R. Lincoln said, if I knew where I was going to die, I would never go there. Well, we don't know when and where we're going to die. So I want to live every day of my life like it's the last day I will ever have upon the face of this earth. Let me borrow your imagination. Don't turn to these scriptures. Look at me. Please, buy the tape. I need the money. Don't take notes. I want to take you to an unusual funeral. You'll find it over in 2 Samuel chapter number 3. It's an unusual situation because David was down at one of the 5 cities of refuge, and there he had all of his mighty men. David always had bodyguards and warriors, and many of them were his nephews and cousins. They were from his own family, and they were good guys, and they'd cut your head off for David. That's deacon material. Somebody said to me, well, those guys wasn't even saved. Well, most deacons aren't, but if they'll cut somebody's head off for you, ordain them and get them saved later. But David's down at one of the cities of refuge, and those cities of refuge is a type of the church, and David was a type of Christ. And one day, David's men went out to fight, and one of his cousins' name was Abner. And Abner was in the prime of life, and he was a great fighter. And while they were fighting the enemy, a young soldier began to chase Abner, and Abner didn't want to kill him. He was young. And Abner turned and looked at him and said, turn to the left or turn to the right, lest I slay thee. And the young man wouldn't obey him, so Abner turned around and drew his sword and slid it under his 5th rib. When he pulled the sword out, the man fell on the dirt road and kicked in his own blood till he died. And Abner ran back to the city of refuge, the church. He was in fellowship with David, a type of Christ. But that young soldier's brother sent word to Abner and said, look, I'm his older brother. I'm the enemy, and I'm sending word to you. If you ever leave the city of refuge, I'll kill you for what you've done to my brother. I've read this book forward and backward, and I still don't understand why Abner one day left the city of refuge, got away from David, got out of church, and began to wander alone. And sure enough, Brother Buchanan, standing somewhere in the shadow, was that young soldier's older brother. And the Bible said he drew his sword and slid it under his 5th rib and killed Abner, just like Abner had killed his younger brother. When word got back to David, they had Abner's funeral. It was all over with. And the backhoe had dug the hole at the cemetery, and they were carrying his casket up to bury him. And somebody said, look, David's king, but he's also his cousin. Why don't we let David give a word of testimony at his gravesite? Here's King David, all of Israel is turned out, and they said, David, is there something you'd like to say about Abner? He could have talked about his kinship. He could have talked about him being a mighty man of valor. But here's what David said. Died Abner as a fool dieth. You know, if some of us preachers would start being more honest at funerals, I think we'd get a lot less phone calls than what we've been getting. And he said he died like a fool, and he died premature, and it was not a necessity, and it should have never have happened. But when you get out of fellowship with the Lord, and you get out of church, the place of refuge, you're going to wind up the last chapter of your life dying like a fool. And let me tell you something about the world. They don't care how long you live for God. You quit now, the only thing they're going to remember about you are the days you quit on the Lord. Dr. Buchanan's been to my home, and in my living room hangs a large picture that was painted by one of the most gifted artists in our generation. I love to read his life story, and that picture meant so much to me. He painted for me in his art gallery in California, and even wrote me a note on the back of it in pencil and sent it to me. It's 30 inches tall and 40 inches wide. He even put it in his own custom-made frame and sent it to me. And he always meant a lot to me. His testimony was amazing because while he was in art school, somebody gave him a Bible and he got saved. And he decided that he was going to give his talent to God. And God blessed him so much in his lifetime. Him and I were the same age, 54 years old. And he was so gifted that when he got out of school, he said, I'm dedicating my paintings to God. Everything I'm going to do is going to have a message of the gospel in it. And in the painting that he sent me, after he signed his name, underneath it, he put John 3:16. Every painting he ever painted, he put John 3:16 in the bottom right-hand corner. Every painting he ever painted has eagles up in the sky, coming from Isaiah chapter number 40. And he had a godly wife and several beautiful young children. And God began to bless him. He was the only living painter in my generation that is allowed to go inside the private Norman Rockwell studio and paint. He could go to nations that were not allowed to receive the gospel. He was opened up to China and all kinds of different countries, and they would let him come over there because of his ability to paint. And he was known as the painter of lights. And if you have one of his paintings, as you turn the lights down, it's almost like his paintings illuminate. His name is Thomas Kinkade. Anybody ever heard of him? And every time I look at that picture, I'm amazed at the beauty and the glory that's in that picture. Many times on television when he was on QVC, you men don't know what that is, but trust me, your wife does. He would always talk about being a painter of lights and how that the light of the glorious gospel could save anybody. I read not long ago an article where the last 5 years of his life, he made $110 million a year. After everything was paid for, he cleared $110 million a year the last 5 years of his life. I couldn't imagine spending that much money in a lifetime. Now a woman, no problem. No problem. And they took his paintings and they put them on Bible covers. They put them on lampshades. Everywhere you go, you could see the artistic work that Thomas Kinkade was gifted by God to give. He died last year. He died last year of a mixture of drugs and liquor. He had left his beautiful wife and Christian family and young children and was living with a woman of ill repute. Several times the police had been called to where they were dwelling because of domestic violence, fussing and fighting and cussing. Because of a mixture of liquor and drugs, he overdosed, and they found him dead. And I'm not going to lie to you, I've got to be honest with you. When I look at that painting, it's different now. Does that make sense to you? There's something about that painting, preacher, that I don't know that I can explain it. I know all the open doors God gave him. I know the millions he made, and he was a gifted man. He gave untold millions of dollars away to charity. He was a very kind-hearted man. He was very bold in his testimony, had a beautiful wife and family. He had it all going for him, and I know all of those things were real and true. But I look at that painting now, and something... It kind of sours in me, and I think to myself, you ought to be alive and well. You ought to be with your wife. You ought to be on the front porch with your children. You ought to be enjoying the blessings of God. But instead, you're in a premature grave. I want to tell you something, friend. Whether you're a pauper or whether you're a millionaire, when you get out of fellowship with Him and you get out of the house of God, you're going to die like a fool. You're going to be a fool. Is that how you want the last chapter of your life to be? Second of all, let me take you over to 2 Timothy chapter 4. The Apostle Paul's in the basement of the dungeon, and he's about to lose his head for the cause of Christ. Luke comes down to visit him, and Paul said, "Good morning, Luke, how are you doing?" And he said, "Fine." He said, "Luke, where's Demas?" "Paul, that's why I'm here. I got up this morning, there was a note on Demas's bed. Said he's gone." He's gone. "What do you mean he's gone? I need him now more than ever before." And he said, "Paul, I don't even want to tell you this, but he went back to Thessalonica. If you'll study the life of Demas, you'll find out that's where he was converted. He was a Gentile. Thessalonica was Gentile people, and it was a city totally given over to lasciviousness and immorality and lewdness and perversion. And when Demas got saved, he forsook his family, his inheritance, and everything he had and said, "I want to follow the Apostle Paul." And several times in the New Testament, he called him a fellow soldier and a fellow servant. I've often wondered what Demas could have been had he not quit on God. And he went back to Thessalonica, which is exactly what God saved him out of. Hey, you know how I know some of you in trouble? I'm going to tell you how I know you're in trouble, buddy. Because you're getting back in the stuff God saved you out of. I don't care how far out of Egypt you say you are, if all you want's the leeks and the garlics and the milling, it ain't going to be long. You're going to be back in the same mess God saved you out of. Let's go to Thessalonica. Funeral's taking place. I look up there at the front, and there's Demas. It's hard to believe he quit on Paul. Man, I've thought about what a giant he could have been for God, being under the ministry of one of the greatest Christians that ever lived. But Demas didn't die a fool. He died a failure. I didn't get in this thing to quit. I didn't get saved to serve God 10 years. I didn't get saved to live for the Lord till I retire. I tell you, he bought me with a price. Therefore, I'm to glorify him in my body because it belongs to him. And whether I live to be 70 or 700, whatever it might be, my life is to be a reflection of the Lord Jesus and the grace of God that he has shed abroad. I wonder, Dr. Buchanan, if we just had the people at Central Baptist Church tonight that has been a member of this church since you've been pastor, this building would be full, the choir would be full, the balcony would be full, and you know, Brother Bartlett, the parking lot would be full. But look at us tonight. What happens to people? They fail God. They quit on God. Things don't work out in their life, and they're so shallow-minded that they think because something didn't work out right, the best thing to do is to quit on God. That's the biggest mistake you'll ever make in your life, honey. When things aren't going right in your life, it's not a time to run from God. It's a time to run to God. And if you fail God and you quit and you turn cold and you go back, there's a day of reaping coming. You'll regret it. Even on your deathbed, you'll regret it. I got a phone call some time ago, and a woman that knew me long before I was saved said they've sent my son home to die with leukemia. And I want you to come pray for my son. He don't want to die in a hospital. He wants to die at home. So I went down to their house, and it was a cold winter night. And she opened the door, and she said, now, preacher, if you don't want to do this, I understand. She said, because it's bad. She said the cancer in his body is eating the platelets out of his blood so fast that as fast as they give him a transfusion, it's gone. And she said because there's no platelets, his blood is so thin, she said it's dripping out of his eyes, his nose, and his mouth. The blood's running out of his body. And she said, if you can't handle that, I understand. It won't hurt my feelings. But I just need you to pray. She said his tongue has become one large scab, and his tongue looks like that of a pickle coming out of his mouth. And I said, ma'am, I'm here to be a blessing. I want to be a help. Just show me where he's at. She said they've brought him home. They've laid him on the couch. And she said, preacher, he's so weak he can't even sit up. He won't even be able to sit up off the couch. She said we have to pick him up and carry him to the bathroom like a baby. And I turned that corner that day, ladies and gentlemen, and I looked, and there was nothing but the frame of a human laying on the couch. 16-year-old boy, whiter than snow. Dark bags under both of his eyes, and sure enough, blood was running out of the corner of his eyes, the base of his ears, and the sides of his mouth. You could smell the cancer eating his body. I went over on the edge of the couch and sat down, and I took his hand, and it was as cold as ice. And I looked that 16-year-old boy in the face, and I said, son, I'm here to talk to you about something very serious. He said, preacher, you know they've sent me home to die. I'm going to die. I said, yes, sir. I know that. But I want to tell you the greatest story you'll ever hear. That boy never interrupted me. I never saw him blink an eye. He never turned away from me. He never seemed bored. He was so intent with everything I said. Are you listening? Talking about being a failure. Talking about quitting. His mom and dad were standing at the edge of the couch with tears running down their face. And when I got done, I looked at that young boy and I said, now, son, what are you going to do with the gospel? And he looked at me and he said, preacher, I listened to everything you said, but I don't believe a word of that. I don't believe there's a heaven or a hell. I don't believe that Jesus died and shed his blood for all. I don't believe a word of that. I said, son, you're about to die. How can you say that? Here's what he said. How'd you like to live with this on you the rest of your life? He said, I'll tell you why I don't believe it. Because that's my mom and dad. And they love me. And if there was a place called hell, they would have already told me. My daddy loves me. And if daddy thought that I was going to hell, my daddy would have already told me a long time long ago what you told me tonight. And when he said that daddy fell to his knees like a dead man. And I heard him cry out on the edge of that couch, "Oh my God!" Several days later, my phone rang and I knew exactly who it was. There was a screaming mama on the other end of the line. "Oh God, my boy died this morning. Preacher, my boy died." And all I could see in my mind was that young boy lifting his hands out of the fire saying, "Oh God, Daddy, if this was real, why didn't you tell me?" She said, "Preacher, the nurse came by last night and told me my son wouldn't live through the night." So she said, I pulled a rocking chair up beside his bed and I had my sweater on and I was beside the couch. And she said, I was just rocking there watching my son die. And she said, I've been so exhausted through taking care of him. She said, I know this doesn't sound right, but I dozed off. I'm just so tired. It was the middle of the night. And she said, while I was sitting there in that rocking chair, dozed off, she said, it was like somebody took my arm and shook it. And it seemed so real to me that it woke me up. And I looked around the dark room and there was nobody in the room. And I thought I must have been dreaming. And then I looked on the couch to check on my son. And oh, dear Lord, he's gone. He's gone! And she said, I looked and he had rolled off the couch onto the floor. And he had crawled on his elbows over to his mama because she wouldn't wake up. And he grabbed her sleeve and with all the energy he had left, he shook her. When she seen him in the floor, she got down and said, son, what are you doing in the floor? What are you doing out of the couch? He said, Mama, I tried calling your name and you wouldn't wake up. Mama, I need you to do something for me. She said, honey, what do you want Mama to do? He said, call Brother Kidd and tell him I got saved. And he died in the floor. He never lived long enough to even pick him up and lay him on the couch. His last bit of energy in life, he wanted Mama to know, I got saved, Mama. 6 months later, his daddy was lying in the hospital, eat up with lung cancer. I went to his bedside, and this is what his daddy said. He said, preacher, there's 2 reasons why I'm glad I'm dying. Number 1, I want to go to heaven and tell Jesus I'm sorry for quitting on him years ago. I quit on God before my son was born, and I raised him in a home without God and the Bible and the truth, and my boy almost went to hell. And he said, the second reason why I'm glad I'm dying is I want to get to heaven and hug my son and tell him I'm so sorry. Is that what you want the last chapter of your life to be? You go ahead, you quit on God, you fail God, you get back in the same mess God saved you out of, and there'll be a lot of people that you could have won to God that may go to hell. That funeral home over there in Matthew 27, that thing's packed overflowing, people standing outside. Hey, come here. Who died? Man, you haven't heard? No, I hadn't seen a funeral like this in a long time. Man, that's Judas. That's one of the Lord's disciples. Preacher man died. Said he hung himself. Committed suicide. So we get in line and finally we make it up there, and there's Judas, and he's got on his religious robe, and maybe somebody's put a Bible in his hand or in the corner of the casket. But when I look up there at Judas, he's not a fool and he's not a failure. He's a fake. He knew how to act. He knew what to say. He knew how to pretend, but he was never real. He was such a good fake that when Jesus said, one of you is a devil and you're going to betray me, they didn't even know who it was. He was so trusted, they made him the treasurer of the church. This Judas walked with Jesus for 3.5 years. He watched Jesus walk on water, make the blind to see, the lame to walk. He even watched him raise the dead to life again. He watched him take 2 fish and 5 hush puppies and feed 35,000 people. But he was never really saved. I'm getting to be old. And the older I get, the more I'm convinced that if God were to open up our spiritual eyes and show us how many people claim to be a Christian that are really not, I think we'd all be a little shocked tonight. Let me illustrate. Pastor, these are not donated in memory of somebody, are they? I picked up a flower pot one time that was donated in memory of some lady's dog. And she freaked. I mean, she freaked out. And her heart pacer went off so bad it was opening the garage door in the parsonage next door. So, now let me tell you something about these flowers. They're beautiful. Are they not beautiful? And we've come so far with artificial flowers, it's kind of hard to tell the real from the fake. And this thing looks so real. I mean, seriously, when I come out the other night, I said, man, that's beautiful. Roses growing up that stem. And some of you may have seen me. I grabbed it. And I said, man, this thing's not real, but it's gorgeous. I mean, this is beautiful stuff. And, but there's several things about this that kind of reveals to me it's not real. Number one, it never grows. If you leave this flower here in this corner 15 years from now, that's exactly what you're going to see. There's no growth to it. Do you know how many sermons this flower's heard? You think about how many times Dr. Buchanan's preached to these flowers and probably got better response than some of you. Good preaching, Brother Kidd. But you can preach to these flowers all you want. Grow! I said grow! You can scream at it. Scream at them. Help yourself. They're not going to grow because they're not real. I'll tell you something else. When plants and flowers grow, they drop little seedlings all around them because they have fruit and they want to multiply. This will never happen here. Why are we so naive to think that people that's been in our church 15 years and they've never grown any at all and they've never had any fruit in their life? Why do we try to convince ourselves they're real? Why don't you wake up to reality? They don't have anything. You can water them, you can pray over them, you can preach them, you can put miracle grow in. I don't care what you do. They're fake. And I'm convinced these people that we've invested our lives in our ministries and we preach and we pray and we feed them and we try to do everything we can to get them to be something for God, and they produce absolutely nothing and they never grow. The truth of the matter is they've never been saved. Are you real? I said some time ago, there's going to be some folks in heaven we didn't think we were going to be there. There's going to be some folks in hell that we thought were going to be in heaven. Are you going to be one of them? I'm closing with the last funeral, Luke chapter 23. Jesus is hanging on the cross, and there's two thieves hanging on the cross with him, one on each side. Now let me tell you something about these thieves. Everything you could say about them is true. That could be negative. Because one of them even testified, we're getting our just dues. So let's go to these thieves. They've probably got tattoos from the top of their head to the bottom of their feet. They probably got piercings in their snout, tongue, earlobes, eyes, belly buttons, toenails. They probably got a rap sheet as long as a roll of toilet paper. They're God cussers. They got liquor on their breath, track marks on their arms from drugs. You don't find anybody at the foot of their cross begging for them. They're such a disaster, their own families don't even want to be identified with them. Nobody's trying to get any mercy on these guys, and they're cussing Jesus along with the rest of the crowd. The Bible said they cast the same at his teeth. They're ungodly. They're filthy. They're vagabonds. They're tramps. They probably got illegitimate children all over the country. They're wanted from the law in different counties and different parts of the state. Everything negative, ungodly, filthy, and nasty you could say about them is probably true. And if they had died that way, what a way to close the last chapter of your life. But one of them looked at Jesus and said, Lord, I'm dirty. And I am one messed up dude. And I don't have anything to offer you. And I'm coming with tattoos and body piercings, and I'm a drunk, and I'm a dope addict, and I've shacked up, and I've had illegitimate children, and I've been to prison, and I've cussed God, and I've even made fun of you, and I ought to be in hell, but I want you to remember me. When thou comest into thy kingdom, and Jesus said, today shalt thou be with me in paradise. I'm saying you don't have to die a fool. You don't have to die a failure. You don't have to die a fake. You can die forgiven. You ought to want one of the chapters of your life to be in bold print. One day I went to Calvary, and by the grace of Almighty God, in spite of the fact of what I was, God forgave me of all my sin. I'm closing with a true story. Many years ago, back in World War II, a young soldier was hitchhiking to St. Louis to catch a train, go over to the coast, and go to Germany for his second term in World War II. It was snowing outside, and it was cold, and it was a wet, heavy snow. And he was standing on the side of the road with his army uniform on and a big old backpack. You know, back then you could pick up hitchhikers. And he said, I was out there in the snow, and cars were blowing by me in that busy road trying to get to St. Louis. And he said, all of a sudden, a big old long Buick went by me. I'm talking, now you young people won't relate to this, but I'm talking about back when cars were made of steel. Yeah, you laugh. You drive that little rice burner you got. You hit a Chihuahua, it'll kill everybody in it. There's not enough metal in your car to make a sardine can. That big old Buick pulled over, and he said, I knew when I opened the door, I was in the presence of royalty. He said the man had on handmade Italian suits. Said his shoes would glow in the dark, big expensive silk tie, silver hair, and every hair in place. And he said, open the door, and he said, get in, soldier, where are you going? He said, I threw my backpack in the back, and I got in that big old long Buick. We started down the road towards St. Louis, and I said, sir, I'm a soldier. I'm going back to Germany for my second term in World War II. And he was telling him the story, and he looked at the older man and said, what about you? He said, well, I'm a wealthy businessman, and I've made a lot of money in my life, and I was just coming back from one of my businesses, and I seen you hitchhiking, and why, sure, I want to help everybody that believes in this country. And they were going down the road, and he said, young man, aren't you afraid of dying in Germany over there in all that snow and cold and away from home and family? He said, no, sir, I'm not afraid to die in Germany. And he said, there's two reasons why. Number one, I love America. And I love what she stands for. And I love the flag. And I just as soon die in Germany as here because I love our freedom. He said, second of all, I'm a born-again Christian. I've been saved. And I just soon go to heaven from Germany as I would the United States. It doesn't matter to me, and I know it doesn't matter to God, so I just soon go to Germany. And he said, I turned and looked at the silver-haired man and said, have you ever been born again? And he said, when I said that, he hit the steering wheel of that big old Buick. It sounded like a shotgun went off. He said, I can't believe this. He said, man, cool, chill, what's the problem? He said, look, I'm a businessman. I make money. Don't feed me this born-again nonsense. He said, I want to ask you something. Did my wife set you out on the side of the road to try to get me to... He said, sir, I don't even know who you are, what you're talking about. He said, look, my wife got saved about 30 years ago. And every time I come home, she's talking about being born again. It's time to go to church. Honey, I'm praying for you. You can't go to heaven without Jesus. She said the same exact thing you just said. Now I'll tell you something. Don't say another word. Shut up. Soldier said, I didn't want to get back out in the snow, so I shut up. Said he got me in front of the train station, I opened the door to get out, and I turned and I thanked the old man. He said, I opened the back door to get my backpack, and the old man said, hey, soldier, hey, I want to tell you I'm sorry for the way I shouldn't have done that to you. You're defending me and giving me the right to be a free man, and I may never see you again. I'm sorry. I've just heard this stuff about being saved for so long. Would you forgive me? And he said, well, sure, I forgive you, sir. I'm just a Christian, and I want everybody to go to heaven. He said, look, how could I make this up to you? He said, just let me sit down in your front seat and tell you how to be a Christian. He said, get in. So he said, I slid back in the front seat of that big old Buick. And he said, I looked at the old man, began to give him the gospel, and his lip began to quiver. And instead of hitting the steering wheel with his hand, he hit it with his head. And wrapped his arms around the neck of that steering wheel and begged God for forgiveness. He led him to Christ in front of a train station. He had a little Bible that the army gave him. He took it out of his backpack, gave it to the old man, said, I want you to read this. Don't ever forget me. The old man gave him a card and said, look, if you live to get back from Germany, look me up. I'll put you in business. You won me to Christ. I understand now why my wife has had such a burden. I can't wait to get home and tell my wife that I got bored again. When he finished his term in Germany, he kept the card and he came back. He went to the old man's house. Little silver-haired lady came to the door and he presented the card and said, "Does this man live here now?" She said, "No, I'm sorry, he's not here." And he said, "Do you know where I can find him?" And she said, "No, I don't." She said, "Sir, he's dead." He said, "Oh, I'm so sorry." She said, "Well, I'm his widow. I'm his wife." And she said, "He's been dead about a year." And she broke down weeping. And she said, "Soldier, I know you don't know us from Adam," but she said, "As far as I know, he went to hell. My husband never got saved. I'm a Christian and I never could lead him to God. And we don't know what happened, but he dropped somebody off at a train station about a year ago in St. Louis. And coming back in that snowstorm, he lost control of the car and hit a truck head on and he died. And he never made it home from the train station. As far as I know, taking a soldier down to that station, my husband died and went to hell." He said, "Honey, if you'll let me in and sit down, there's a chapter that you don't know about." And he told about leading him to Christ in front of that train station. He had no idea when he put it in drive and pulled off from that station that he would never live long enough to get home to take the key out of the car. Aren't you glad the last chapter of your life you can let your family and friends close the book and say, "Thank God there's one thing I know. They've been forgiven." Let's stand with our heads bowed. I'm asking you a question right now. What our heads are bowed, what are they going to say about you?